He mailed pieces of his victims to newspapers. He wrote to the police mocking them. He called in his own murders to the Vallejo Police Department while the bodies were still warm. He wore a hood with his own symbol stitched onto it. He walked up to two people in broad daylight, tied them up, and stabbed them like he was doing a job. And then he just walked away. Not running, walking. He was never caught. He was never charged. He was never named by any police department in America. For 56 years, the man who called himself the Zodiac Killer remained the most taunting, most theatrical, most terrifying unsolved mystery in American criminal history. But in 2024, something changed. An artificial intelligence was given every single piece of evidence that had ever existed in this case. Every letter, every cipher, every crime scene report, every suspect file, every handwriting sample, every geographic data point. All of it. And it was told to do one thing: find what 56 years of human investigation missed. And when it finished running every variable simultaneously, one name came back. Not as one possibility among many, as the overwhelming statistical answer. A name that had been sitting in those case files for decades. A name that had been looked at briefly and then set aside because the man did not quite fit the profile investigators had built. A house painter from Vallejo, California, who died in 2018 without ever answering a single question. And today I want to take you through the complete story, from the very first murder to the AI analysis to exactly where the evidence stands right now. Because this is not a simple story, and anyone who tells you it is not being straight with you. The Zodiac case began on a cold December night in 1968, the 20th of December. A two-lane road outside the small city of Benicia in Northern California called Lake Herman Road. 17-year-old Betty Lou Jensen and 16-year-old David Faraday drove out there on their very first date. She had told her parents she would be home by 11. They parked in a gravel turnout. What happened next unfolded in minutes and left almost nothing behind. A vehicle pulled in close. A man got out. There were no words, no robbery, no warning. David Faraday was shot once in the head at point-blank range as he tried to get out of the car. Betty Lou Jensen ran. She made it perhaps 30 feet across the dark ground before she was shot 5 times in the back. 5 bullets fired into a running, terrified 17-year-old girl on her first date. When they were found, there was no weapon, no witness, no connection between the killer and the victims. Just 2 young bodies on a cold roadside, in a county that had absolutely no idea what it was dealing with. He waited nearly 7 months. Then, on the 4th of July, 1969, in the city of Vallejo, a 22-year-old waitress named Darlene Farron and a 19-year-old named Michael Mageau drove to Blue Rock Springs Park. A quiet spot away from the holiday noise. A car pulled in behind them, left, and then came back. That detail, the leaving and returning, told investigators something important later. It suggested a hunter circling, making sure. A man approached the driver's side with a bright flashlight and a pistol. He opened fire without a word. Darlene Farron was fatally wounded. Michael Mageau was shot multiple times and left for dead. But against every odd, he survived. And for the first time, someone who had looked directly at the Zodiac lived to describe him. A stocky white male, heavy-set, in his late 20s or early 30s, with a large face and short hair. That description would drive the investigation for the next 5 decades. And it would ultimately, in one of the most critical ways, point investigators toward the wrong assumptions. 40 minutes after the shooting, before any news of it had broken publicly, a man called the Vallejo Police Department. In a flat, controlled voice, he told the dispatcher he wished to report a double murder. He gave the location. And then he said something that stopped the room cold. He claimed the December murders on Lake Herman Road as his own work too. 2 crime scenes, months and miles apart that no one had publicly connected. He linked them himself. He offered details only the shooter could have known, and then he hung up before the call could be traced. The police were no longer chasing an isolated tragedy. They were chasing something that was chasing them back. On the 1st of August, 1969, 3 separate envelopes arrived at 3 different Bay Area newspapers. Each one contained a portion of a longer message, and each one carried a threat. Publish this on the front page, or I will go on a killing spree this weekend and cut down a dozen people. Inside each envelope was also a piece of a cipher, 48 symbols long. A wall of strange characters the writer claimed held his true identity. He believed no one could break it. He was wrong about that one. A high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, working at their kitchen table, cracked the code by hand in about a week. No computers, just patience, pencil, and the logic of language patterns. What came out of those symbols was a message that revealed how this killer thought. He boasted that killing was the most thrilling thing he had ever experienced, more thrilling than anything else in life. He wrote that everyone he murdered would become his slave in the afterlife, servants he was collecting for some world beyond this one. And at the bottom of the letter, for the first time, there was the symbol. A circle crossed by a vertical and a horizontal line, like the crosshairs of a gun sight. The mark that would define him. The birth, in ink and in blood, of the name Zodiac. But he was not done performing. On September 27th, 1969, at a place called Lake Berryessa, he arrived wearing something no witness would ever forget. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, two college students, were relaxing by the water on a warm Saturday afternoon. They noticed a man in the distance walking toward them. He drifted behind a tree, and they thought little of it. But when he emerged again, he was wearing a black executioner-style hood that fell across his chest with slits cut for his eyes. And stitched or drawn onto the fabric over his heart was that same crossed circle symbol, worn now like a coat of arms. He told them he was an escaped convict who needed their car and money to get to Mexico. He had Cecilia bind Brian's hands, and then he bound Cecilia himself. For a few moments it seemed like a robbery, survivable. And then, without raising his voice, without any signal at all, he drew a knife and began to stab them. He stabbed Brian Hartnell repeatedly in the back. He stabbed Cecilia Shepard many more times, methodically, like he was completing a task on a checklist rather than attacking a human being. Then he walked away. He did not run. He walked. He went to their car and wrote on the door with a felt marker the dates of his previous attacks, the words by knife, and above them the symbol. He was signing the scene the way a painter signs a canvas. Brian Hartnell survived. Cecilia Shepard did not. And before the ambulances had even finished their work, a man called the police from a payphone in a nearby town and calmly claimed it. When investigators lifted a palm print from that phone, they had physical evidence at last, but no matching hand to press it against. 2 weeks later, he changed cities and methods again. October 11th, 1969. A cab driver named Paul Stein picked up a fare in downtown San Francisco. The passenger asked to be taken to Presidio Heights. When the cab stopped at the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger raised a pistol and shot Paul Stein once in the head at point-blank range. But this time, there were witnesses. A group of teenagers watching from a house across the street saw the killer lean over the body, tear a section from Paul Stein's blood-soaked shirt, wipe down parts of the cab unhurried, and then step out and walk north into the darkness of the Presidio. Not running, walking. The composite sketch that emerged from their descriptions became one of the most reproduced faces in American criminal history. A white male, heavy-set, wearing glasses, with short, reddish-brown hair. An ordinary-looking man you might pass in a hardware store without a second glance. That very night, patrol officers had stopped and spoken to a man on foot near the scene. But a description broadcast over police radio had wrongly described the suspect as black. And so the officers let the man continue on his way. It was one of several moments across those terrible months when the Zodiac stood within arm's reach of law enforcement and simply slipped through, protected less by cunning than by the gap between what people expected the killer to look like and what he actually was. 3 days after Paul Stein died, a letter arrived at a San Francisco newspaper with a piece of blood-stained fabric inside, a swatch cut from Paul Stein's shirt, offered as grim proof of authorship, a receipt for murder. The letter taunted the police for letting him walk away that night. And it was signed for the first time in full with the name he had chosen for himself, Zodiac. He had a symbol, a body count, an unbroken record of escape, and now he had a title. He was no longer a suspect. He was a character. Over the years that followed, more letters came. Some contained new ciphers. Some contained crime details or claims of new victims that could never be confirmed. A Halloween card. A threat to blow up a school bus full of children, complete with a hand-drawn wiring diagram showing how he would rig the explosives and pick off the survivors as they fled. He referenced movies. He referenced songs. He wrote with a strange, mocking playfulness laid over an abyss of casual cruelty, misspelling the same words the same way every single time, as if the errors were themselves a kind of fingerprint he could not help leaving. He claimed his victim count kept rising. 37, he wrote once, keeping a running score against a police force that could not even confirm his name. And then, in the middle of the 1970s, the letters began to thin, to slow, and finally to stop. The great silence of the Zodiac case began. For decades, that silence held. Detectives retired with the file still open on their desks. Some carried it to their graves. New investigators inherited boxes of paper. Thousands of suspects were looked at and cleared. Millions of dollars were spent. And DNA technology arrived and solved cold cases far older than this one. Yet still, the Zodiac remained a ghost. The case did not suffer from a shortage of evidence. It suffered from an excess of it. A mountain of documents, dates, handwriting samples, geographic markers, and behavioral details that no team of humans could ever fully cross-reference at the same time. Because human investigators work in sequence. They follow one lead, then another. And by the time they reach the 10th lead, the details of the first have already begun to blur. They build a profile. A stocky man in his late 20s or early 30s, the age Michael Mageau described on that terrible July night. And without meaning to, they begin to measure every suspect against that profile, quietly discarding the ones who do not fit. It is not laziness. It is how the human mind works under the weight of too much information. But in this case, that very instinct became the killer's best protection, because somewhere in those files, the connections were already there. The clues had been documented. The patterns were visible on the page. They simply needed to be seen all at once by something that would not tire, would not assume, and would not flinch from a pattern just because it pointed somewhere unexpected. For 56 years, no such thing existed, and then in 2024, someone decided to try an experiment. An artificial intelligence system, a machine built to recognize patterns across enormous and chaotic sets of data, was given the complete Zodiac case archive. Not a summary, not the highlights. The entire thing. Every letter, every cipher, every witness statement, every geographic coordinate, every suspect file, every scrap of handwriting, every timeline that had ever been assembled by human hands. And it was given one open-ended instruction. Find the patterns that human investigators might have missed. Do not assume anything about who the killer was. Do not privilege one theory over another. Simply look at all of it simultaneously and tell us what you see. What the machine did was not detective work in any way a human would recognize. It did not have hunches. It did not get tired. It did not fall in love with a favorite suspect and bend the evidence to fit. It processed every variable at the same time. The loops and slants of the handwriting, the exact placement of the misspellings, the geographic center of the crimes, the timing of every letter measured against calendars and public records, the linguistic fingerprints buried in the taunting prose. It cross-referenced these against databases of population data, known suspects, writing samples pulled from employment records, DMV files, and military paperwork. It ran comparisons that would have taken a room full of analysts a lifetime to complete. And it did not care in the slightest what the answer turned out to be. When it finished, one name rose above every other with a statistical gap so large the difference itself was alarming. The name was Gary Francis Post, an Air Force veteran turned house painter who had lived in the Bay Area throughout the exact years when the Zodiac was active. A man who was not a recluse, not a phantom, an ordinary-looking man you would pass without a second glance. His name had been in the files the whole time. It had surfaced briefly decades earlier and then been set aside because the man was a little too old. He did not quite fit the profile built around Michael Mageau's frightened estimate on that July night. And so, like the man, walking calmly through Presidio Heights while patrol cars rolled past, he had been allowed to slip through the gap between expectation and reality. The machine had no expectations to slip through. It saw only the data. The AI analysis began with handwriting because that is where the Zodiac had left the most of himself. The system pulled everything it could find bearing Post's hand. Employment forms filled out in block letters, DMV paperwork, personal notes, signatures across decades of ordinary life. Then it laid those samples against the letters that had terrorized Northern California. It measured letter formations, the precise spacing between words, the angle of every stroke, the way certain characters connected and others stood apart, the variations in pressure where the pen bore down and where it lifted. Hundreds of microscopic features, each one quantified. And feature after feature, the correlation held. The AI reported alignment across more than 90 distinct measurable characteristics between Post's known writing and the Zodiac's letters, a level of overlap calculated to occur by pure chance less than 1 time in 10 million. The Zodiac had misspelled certain words in a consistent, idiosyncratic way. The same errors surfacing again and again across years of correspondence. The words paradise misspelled as paradise. The word slaves used repeatedly in the context of his afterlife beliefs. Post, in his own unrelated writing, made those very same spelling mistakes. He used distinctive turns of phrase that echoed the letters. His writing reflected the same level of education, the same cultural references, the same odd mixture of crudeness and strange cleverness that had always made the Zodiac so difficult to place. It was as if two voices, separated by decades and by the deliberate intent to remain hidden, had been revealed to be one. Then the geography aligned. The system had calculated a zone of highest probability, a statistical bullseye of likely origin drawn from the pattern of the crimes and the mailings. That bullseye centered on Vallejo. Post had lived in Vallejo. He had worked there as a house painter, a job with irregular hours, no one watching the clock, that put him behind the wheel of a vehicle moving from address to address, across the exact region where the killings occurred. His work routes had carried him past crime scene locations. He had documented familiarity with Lake Berryessa, the isolated spot where a hooded man had tied up 2 young people beneath the trees. The Casebreakers, a team of more than 40 former law enforcement investigators, journalists, and military intelligence officers who had been working this case independently for years, had additionally found photos from Post's darkroom showing scars on his forehead that matched marks described on witness sketches of the Zodiac. They found a heel print of a military-style boot at crime scenes that matched the style and size Post wore. They found brown-colored hair at crime scenes consistent with Post's coloring. They found a wristwatch with paint splatter on it, recovered from a crime scene, that appeared consistent with the watch of someone who had spent decades painting houses. And when the timeline analysis mapped every confirmed Zodiac murder and every letter against the record of Post's life, it found something that made the room go cold. He had no alibi. Not for one confirmed murder, not for a single mailing. He controlled his own schedule, answered to no one, and left no proof that he had ever been anywhere other than exactly where the Zodiac had been. But the detail that landed hardest was the silence. The Zodiac's letters had come in waves through the late 60s and into the early 70s. Sporadic bursts of ego and menace. And then, in the mid-70s, they dropped off sharply, almost as if the voice had been switched off. Investigators had puzzled over that silence for decades. What had happened? Why did he stop writing? And when the analysis overlaid Post's record onto that timeline, the quiet had a direct answer. In the mid-70s, Gary Francis Post was arrested and incarcerated on assault charges. The letters stopped when the man was put behind bars. When he could no longer move freely, no longer control his own hours, no longer walk into a post office unremarked, the Zodiac went silent too. The correlation between his incarceration and the end of the letters was not approximate. It was direct. Now here is where I have to be completely straight with you, because honesty is the only thing that makes this story mean anything. The physical evidence is real, but it is not complete. The DNA recovered from the stamps and envelopes of the Zodiac's letters had already excluded several famous suspects over the years. That same DNA, degraded and partial as it was, had never been compared against Post because no sample of his had ever been collected. After the AI pointed its finger, family reference samples were finally examined. The result was frustratingly incomplete. No markers ruled him out. Several markers matched. But the DNA was too broken to declare it a definitive hit. The partial palm print lifted from the payphone a cab driver Paul Stein called from was found to be consistent with Post's prints. Consistent, but not conclusive. The fragment was too small to swear to in court. And a facial recognition comparison of Post's photographs from the late 60s against the old composite sketches showed a strong correlation in the underlying bone structure of the face. Suggestive, compelling. Still not the kind of proof that closes a case in a courtroom. The FBI has confirmed the Zodiac case remains open. The San Francisco Police Department has confirmed the Zodiac case remains open. No official law enforcement agency has closed this case on the strength of any of it. Gary Francis Post died in 2018, quietly, without ever being questioned. The machine that would name him would not begin its work for another 6 years, long after the man himself was beyond the reach of any question or any justice. So, what are we actually left with? We are left with a man who was overlooked because he was a little too old, a little too hard to find, a little too unremarkable on paper to warrant a sustained second look. A man who matched the Zodiac's handwriting across more than 90 measurable features at odds of 1 in 10 million. A man who lived and worked exactly where the crimes happened. A man whose work schedule gave him the freedom and the mobility the killer needed. A man whose incarceration aligned precisely with the moment the letters stopped coming. A man who took that secret, if it was a secret, to a quiet grave in 2018. And we are left with the Z340 cipher, one of the most famous unsolved codes in American history, finally cracked in December 2020 after 51 years, not by a government agency with unlimited resources, but by 3 private citizens working across 3 countries. David Orenchak, a software developer from Virginia, Sam Blake, a mathematician from Australia, Jarl van Eyck, a computer programmer from Belgium. They used computational tools the killer himself never imagined would exist. And the message that came out after 51 years of silence was this: I hope you're having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise. The FBI verified the solution, closed the file on that cipher, the Zodiac's own words held hostage and symbols for half a century, finally forced to speak. But the identity cipher, the one that matters most, the one that answers who rather than what, remains the last question without a definitive answer. 2 of the Zodiac's original ciphers remain unsolved to this day, and the official case remains open. Maybe the machine found the answer and the physical evidence simply cannot catch up to what the data already knows. Or maybe, as some serious researchers argue, pattern matching of this kind can construct a compelling case against a dead man who cannot defend himself. And a name that looks like an answer is not always the same thing as a true answer. The truth is that after 56 years, we are closer than we have ever been. And we are still not close enough to say the word everyone wants to hear. The clues, if they are clues, have been sitting in those files the whole time, waiting for something that could hold all of them in its mind at once, without getting tired, without assuming, without being fooled by expectation. And what that something found, after all this time, was the name of an ordinary man, a house painter who walked through life unremarkably, drove from job to job across the hills of Northern California, and may have carried one of the darkest secrets in American history all the way to his grave. Now I want to hear from you. If the handwriting matches across 90 variables, if the geography aligns, if his incarceration matches the silence, if his face matches the sketch, but the DNA is not conclusive and no agency has officially closed the case, where do you land? Is that enough for you to believe Gary Francis Post was the Zodiac Killer? Or do you think the real answer is still out there, hiding behind a name no one has said yet? Tell me exactly where you stand in the comments. And tell me why.